Welcome to Web Lizard Lab's CERT Lab. This is SC-500 practice questions, storage and database security. You will work through 32 questions covering storage encryption, network boundaries, shared access signatures, database authorization, auditing, threat protection, malware scanning, and secure operational sequencing. Listen for the data plane, identity, network, key custody, and service boundary that decides each answer. You will hear each complete scenario and every answer choice. Multi-select questions state how many answers to select. Matching and ordering questions keep the full workspace visible. After the cue, lock in your answer. You will have 3 seconds before the answer appears. Pause whenever you want additional thinking time. Question 1. You create a new Azure Storage account that uses Microsoft Managed Keys. What must you do to enable the standard Azure Storage encryption for data at rest? A. Enable secure transfer required to turn on encryption for stored objects. B. Apply a resource manager lock to activate service-side encryption. C. Assign an Azure RBAC data role before service-side encryption begins. D. Nothing. Azure Storage encryption is enabled for all storage accounts and cannot be disabled. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Nothing. Azure Storage encryption is enabled for all storage accounts and cannot be disabled. Azure Storage service-side encryption is already enabled for every storage account and cannot be disabled. Microsoft Managed Keys are the default key management choice for a new account. Question 2. A storage account uses its public endpoint with selected network restrictions. A branch office must connect through 2 fixed public egress IP ranges. Which configuration directly represents the branch office as an allowed source? A. Add a trusted service exception for the branch office. B. Add an IP network rule for each approved public egress range. C. Add a resource instance rule for the branch VPN device. D. Add a virtual network rule for the branch office local subnet. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Add an IP network rule for each approved public egress range. IP network rules allow traffic from specific public IP address ranges, which directly models the branch office fixed public egress ranges. Question 3. A subscription contains several existing storage accounts and will receive more accounts in the future. The security team wants Defender for Storage to protect both existing and new accounts automatically, except for one approved archive account. What should the team do? A. Enable Defender for Storage at the subscription level and leave the archive account included. B. Enable Defender for Storage individually on the existing accounts, except the archive account. C. Enable Defender for Storage individually on each future account and leave the existing accounts unchanged. D. Enable Defender for Storage at the subscription level and exclude the archive account. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable Defender for Storage at the subscription level and exclude the archive account. Subscription level enablement automatically includes existing and newly created storage accounts. Defender for Storage also permits a specific storage account to be excluded, which satisfies the archive exception. Question 4. A vendor process needs one SaaS token that grants limited access to both Blob storage and Q storage in the same storage account. Which SaaS type meets the service scope requirement? A. User Delegation SaaS. B. Account SaaS. C. Service SaaS. D. Stored Access Policy. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Account SaaS. B is correct. An account SaaS delegates access to resources in one or more Azure storage services, so it can meet the Blob storage plus Q storage requirement. A service SaaS is limited to one storage service. Question 5. A company hosts payroll DB in Azure SQL database. A payroll partner connects from outside Azure and always originates from one stable public IPv4 address. The company wants to permit that source without authorizing an Azure Virtual Network subnet. Which control should you configure? A. An IP firewall rule for the partner's originating public IP address. B. A virtual network rule for the company's Azure application subnet. C. The SQL DB contributor role for the partner identity. D. A customer-managed TDE protector in Azure Key Vault. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. An IP firewall rule for the partner's originating public IP address. An Azure SQL Database IP firewall rule grants database access based on the originating IP address, which directly matches the partner's stable public IPv4 source. Question 6. A DBA enables auditing for an Azure SQL database in the Azure portal and selects an Event Hub's destination. A change scanner then reports a diagnostic setting with the SQL Security Audit Events category enabled. Compliance also wants an Azure Storage copy without interrupting the event stream. Which assessment is correct? A. The diagnostic setting is expected, and storage can be added so audit logs are written to both destinations. B. The diagnostic setting must be removed before storage is selected because auditing supports one destination at a time. C. The diagnostic setting indicates a configuration error because portal-based Event Hub's auditing does not create that setting. D. The event stream must be replaced by storage because combination is supported only between Log Analytics and Event Hubs. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. The diagnostic setting is expected, and storage can be added so audit logs are written to both destinations. When Azure SQL Auditing is configured to Event Hubs through the Azure portal, Azure creates a diagnostic setting with SQL Security Audit Events enabled. Azure Storage, Log Analytics, and Event Hubs destinations can be used in any combination, and logs are written to each selected destination. The scanner result and the requested additional copy are therefore both supported. Question 7. A company hosts its sales database as an Azure SQL single database, a PaaS resource in Azure. Security requires database vulnerability assessment, anomalous activity alerts, and automatic protection for future supported Azure SQL databases in the same subscription. Which Defender for Databases offering should you enable? A. Microsoft Defender for SQL servers on machines. B. Microsoft Defender for open source relational databases. C. Microsoft Defender for Azure SQL databases. D. Microsoft Defender for Azure Cosmos DB. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Microsoft Defender for Azure SQL databases. Microsoft Defender for Azure SQL Databases is the engine and hosting-specific offering that provides vulnerability assessment and anomalous activity alerts for supported Azure SQL resources. At subscription scope, it also covers future supported resources in that subscription. Question 8. A security review finds that an existing Azure Storage account still accepts Azure Storage REST API requests sent over HTTP. The account already uses Azure Storage server-side encryption. You must reject the HTTP REST requests without changing the encryption key model. What should you configure? A. Grant the calling application a narrower Azure RBAC data role. B. Change the account from Microsoft Managed Keys to Customer Managed Keys. C. Enable secure transfer required on the storage account. D. Apply a cannot delete resource manager lock to the storage account. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable secure transfer required on the storage account. Secure transfer required is the transport control that requires Azure Storage REST API operations to use HTTPS and rejects HTTP requests. Service-side encryption protects stored data and does not replace this transport gate. Question 9. A storage account uses its public endpoint. Its default action is currently allow. A production ingestion app runs in an approved Azure subnet, and its access must continue while you enforce selected network filtering. Select and arrange exactly 2 actions from the candidates. Place the actions in the order in which they should be performed. A. Add a virtual network rule for the approved production subnet. B. Set the storage account default action to deny. C. Grant the app identity a storage data role. D. Issue the app a SAS restricted to its current public IP address. Lock in your answer. The correct order is, first, choice A. Add a virtual network rule for the approved production subnet. Second, choice B. Set the storage account default action to deny. First, preserve the required path by adding the approved subnet to the allowed networks. Then, set the default action to deny, which makes the selected network rules effective without intentionally cutting off the production path. Question 10. An administrator enables Defender for Storage malware scanning and expects the built-in soft delete remediation to begin deleting blobs automatically. Which statement correctly describes this remediation? A. It is off by default, and when enabled, works only for blobs detected as malicious. B. It is on by default and applies only to blobs detected as malicious. C. It is off by default and, when enabled, deletes every scanned blob. D. It is inseparable from malware scanning and cannot be configured as a remediation option. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. It is off by default and, when enabled, works only for blobs detected as malicious. The built-in soft delete option is not enabled automatically. Its documented scope is limited to blobs that Defender for Storage detects as malicious. Question 11. An analyst already has Storage Blob Data Reader for a storage account. The analyst must browse blob data in the Azure portal by using Microsoft Entra credentials. Which additional assignment provides the documented management plane visibility with least privilege? A. Storage Queue Data Reader. B. A role containing Generate User Delegation Key. C. Azure Resource Manager Reader. D. A stored access policy on the blob container. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C, Azure Resource Manager Reader. C is correct. Portal access with Microsoft Entra credentials requires both an appropriate blob data access role and Azure Resource Manager Reader. The analyst already has the data plane role, so Reader supplies the missing management plane visibility. Question 12. An Azure SQL database named OperationsDB is used by batch workers running on Azure virtual machines in App Subnet. Security requires the database to accept application traffic only when it originates from that selected subnet, rather than from a list of public client IP addresses. Which control should you configure? A. An IP firewall rule for each virtual machine's public IP address. B. A virtual network rule for app subnet. C. The SQL Server contributor role for the batch worker identity. D. Microsoft Entra authentication without a network rule. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. A virtual network rule for app subnet. Azure SQL Database virtual network rules enable the database to accept communications sent from selected subnets inside a virtual network. So, a rule for app subnet meets the origin requirement. Question 13. Your organization uses Azure SQL Managed Instance. Audit events must be sent to a log analytics workspace through Azure Monitor Logs, and Azure Storage is not an audit destination for this requirement. Which configuration approach should you use? A. Open the Azure SQL Database Auditing page, select Log Analytics, and rely on that portal setting to create the Managed Instance Audit objects. B. Assign Storage Blob Data Contributor to the managed instance, enable storage auditing, and query the storage container from Log Analytics. C. Create a diagnostic setting that sends audit events to Azure Monitor Logs. No SQL Server audit or audit specification is needed afterward. D. Configure a diagnostic setting for Azure Monitor Logs. Then use T-SQL to create and enable the SQL Server audit and audit specification. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Configure a diagnostic setting for Azure Monitor Logs. Then use T-SQL to create and enable the SQL Server audit and audit specification. For Azure SQL Managed Instance, the documented external monitor path begins with a diagnostic setting that selects Event Hubs, Azure Monitor Logs, or both. The workflow then requires the corresponding SQL Server audit and server or database audit specification to be created and enabled with T-SQL. This is distinct from the Azure SQL Database Portal auditing workflow. Question 14. A company runs Azure Database for Postgres Flexible Server as a PaaS resource in Azure. The security team needs alerts for anomalous database access, unusual query patterns, and suspicious activity. Which Defender for Databases offering should you enable? A. Microsoft Defender for Azure SQL Databases. B. Microsoft Defender for Open Source Relational Databases. C. Microsoft Defender for SQL Servers on Machines. D. Microsoft Defender for Azure Cosmos DB. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Microsoft Defender for Open Source Relational Databases. Microsoft Defender for Open Source Relational Databases is the offering for supported open source relational PaaS databases in Azure, including Postgres, and supplies the required anomaly and suspicious activity alerts. Question 15. An administrator applies a cannot delete resource manager lock to an Azure Storage account. Developers who have data plane permissions can still delete blobs. Which statement correctly explains this result? A. The lock protects blobs only after secure transfer required is enabled. B. The lock protects the storage account resource, but it does not prevent deletion of data inside the account. C. The lock prevents blob deletion only when Microsoft Managed Keys are used. D. The lock changes account deletion into an Azure RBAC data plane decision. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. The lock protects the storage account resource, but it does not prevent deletion of data inside the account. The documented resource manager lock boundary is the storage account resource. It can protect the account from deletion or configuration change, but it does not prevent data within the account from being deleted. Question 16. A storage account uses its public endpoint with selected network restrictions. An Azure Analytics orchestrator must access the account, but the orchestrator cannot be isolated through a virtual network rule or an IP network rule. The security team must allow only the named orchestrator instance and must not allow its entire Azure service. Which network rule should you configure? A. A trusted service exception for the orchestrator service. B. A virtual network rule for the orchestrator deployment. C. A resource instance rule for the named orchestrator. D. An IP network rule for the orchestrator service. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. A resource instance rule for the named orchestrator. A resource instance rule admits a specific Azure resource instance that cannot be isolated through virtual network or IP rules. That exactly matches the named orchestrator and avoids a service-wide exception. You have completed 16 questions. Take a moment to reset your attention. In the remaining questions, keep separating data plane authorization from network admission. storage account controls from database permissions, and threat detection from automated response. Question 17. During Defender for Storage on-upload malware scanning, the service has detected a Blob created event and securely retrieved the Blob content. Which sequence correctly completes the documented scanning process? A. Result generation, in-memory scanning, content disposal. B. In-memory scanning, content disposal, result generation. C. In-memory scanning, result generation, content disposal. D. Content disposal, in-memory scanning, result generation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. In-memory scanning, result generation, content disposal. After event detection and blob retrieval, the documented stages are in-memory scanning, result generation, and then immediate content disposal. Question 18. An application team must generate a user delegation SAS for a blob. The team is prohibited from using a storage account key. Which two statements describe the required authorization design? Select 2. A. Use a Microsoft Entra security principle that has a role containing the generate user delegation key action. B. Assign Azure Resource Manager Reader as the only role needed to generate the user delegation key. C. Secure the user delegation SAS with Microsoft Entra credentials rather than the storage account key. D. Bind the user delegation SAS to a stored access policy so the policy issues the delegation key. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. A. Use a Microsoft Entra security principle that has a role containing the generate user delegation key action. C. Secure the user delegation SAS with Microsoft Entra credentials rather than the storage account key. A and C are correct. A Microsoft Entra security principle needs an Azure role that includes microsoft.sting.storage./storageaccounts./bin services./generate user delegation key to obtain the user delegation key. A user delegation SAS is secured with Microsoft Entra credentials instead of an account key. Question 19. A release engineer has the SQL Server contributor role on the logical server that hosts inventory DB in Azure SQL Database. The engineer can perform resource deployment operations, but cannot connect with a Microsoft Entra identity to run the required queries. Network access is already configured. What should you do? A. Create the engineer as a Microsoft Entra principal in master and grant permissions only there. B. Assign SQL DB contributor on inventory DB and grant the role at the database resource scope. C. Create the engineer as a Microsoft Entra principal in inventory DB and grant the required database permissions. D. Create a SQL authenticated user in inventory DB and store its password for the engineer's query client. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Create the engineer as a Microsoft Entra principal in inventory DB and grant the required database permissions. Azure RBAC management roles do not grant Microsoft Entra database connectivity. The identity must be created as a Microsoft Entra principal in each database it needs to access, with the needed database permissions. Question 20. An Azure SQL Database logical server hosts 40 databases. You need one current server-level auditing configuration that captures audit events across all databases. Which statement describes the architecture you should use? A. Configure database-level auditing on every database because server-level auditing still creates one audit session per database. B. Configure server-level auditing. It uses one server-level extended event session for all databases. Database-level auditing remains separate. C. Configure one database-level audit on the first database because its audit session automatically captures events from the other databases. D. Configure one server-level audit session for each database so that the server policy and database policies use the same sessions. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Configure server-level auditing. It uses one server-level extended event session for all databases. Database-level auditing remains separate. The current Azure SQL database server auditing architecture creates one extended event session at the server level that captures audit events for all databases. Database-level auditing remains a separate mechanism, so it is not the way to implement the stated single server-wide configuration. Question 21. A company runs SQL Server 2019 on an on-premises Windows machine. The machine is onboarded to Azure Arc and registered as an Azure Arc SQL Server instance. To deploy Defender for SQL servers on machines at subscription scope, the administrator has subscription owner permissions, the SQL Server service account is a sysadmin, and the required extensions are allowed. Which additional network configuration is required? A. Allow inbound HTTPS traffic on TCP 443 using TLS from *arcdataservices.com. B. Allow outbound SQL traffic on TCP 1433 using TLS to *arcdataservices.com. C. Allow inbound SQL traffic on TCP 1433 using TLS from *arcdataservices.com. D. Allow outbound HTTPS traffic on TCP 443 using TLS to *arcdataservices.com. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Allow outbound HTTPS traffic on TCP 443 using TLS to arcdataservices.com. The machine plan requires outbound HTTPS over TCP 443 using TLS to the regional arcdataservices.com endpoint. The scenario already satisfies the other cited subscription, service account, Arc registration, and extension prerequisites. Question 22. A storage security review defines 4 independent requirements. Match each requirement to the control that directly addresses it. Use each control once. A. Assign least privilege Azure RBAC permissions. B. Apply an Azure Resource Manager lock to the storage account. C. Enable secure transfer required. D. Use a customer-managed key stored in Azure Key Vault or Managed HSM. T1. Reject Azure Storage REST API requests sent over HTTP. T2. Let the organization control and audit the rotation of encryption keys for Blob storage and Azure files. T3. Give a Microsoft Entra application only the data permissions needed for its task. T4. Protect the storage account resource from accidental deletion or configuration changes. Lock in your answer. The correct matches are reject Azure Storage REST API requests sent over HTTP, choice C, enable secure transfer required, let the organization control and audit the rotation of encryption keys for Blob storage and Azure files, choice D, use a customer-managed key stored in Azure Key Vault or Managed HSM, give a Microsoft Entra application only the data permissions needed for its task, choice A, assign least privilege Azure RBAC permissions, protect the storage account resource from accidental deletion or configuration changes, choice B, apply an Azure Resource Manager lock to the storage account, secure transfer required rejects HTTP REST requests, a customer-managed key stored in Azure Key Vault or Managed HSM provides customer key custody for Blob storage and Azure files, least privilege Azure RBAC limits the application's permissions, and an Azure Resource Manager lock protects the storage account resource from accidental or malicious deletion or configuration change. These are distinct control boundaries, yielding T1C, T2D, T3A, and T4B. Question 23. A storage account uses its public endpoint with selected network restrictions. An eligible Azure indexing service operates outside your network boundary and must access the account. The requirement is to allow that trusted service, not a particular service instance or address range. Which configuration should you use? A. Add a resource instance rule for one indexing worker. B. Add an IP network rule for the service outbound addresses. C. Add a virtual network rule for an indexing subnet. D. Add a trusted service exception for the indexing service. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Add a trusted service exception for the indexing service. A trusted service exception is the authorized rule type for a specific eligible Azure service that operates outside the network boundary. The requirement explicitly targets the trusted service rather than one instance, subnet, or IP range. Question 24. A company uses Defender for Storage malware scanning for a customer upload service. After a malicious blob is detected, the company must invoke a logic app that quarantines the blob in near real time. Which Defender for Storage feature should the company use for this outcome? A. Activity monitoring. B. Sensitive data threat detection. C. Event-driven response. D. Malware scanning. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Event-driven response. Event-driven response is the feature that integrates malware detection with Azure Event Grid so that Azure functions or logic apps can perform actions such as quarantine. Malware scanning supplies the detection in this scenario. It is not itself the requested automated response mechanism. Question 25. A storage administrator wants issued SaaS tokens to be associated with stored access policies. Which two token proposals support that design? Select two. A. Object access to a blob storage container through a user delegation SaaS. B. Object access to a blob storage container through a container-level service SaaS. C. Data access across blob storage and Azure files through an account SaaS. D. Message access in a queue storage queue through a queue-level service SaaS. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and D. B. Object access to a blob storage container through a container-level service SaaS. D. Message access in a queue storage queue through a queue-level service SaaS. B and D are correct because a stored access policy provides server-side control over service SaaS. The underlying storage service can differ. Compatibility depends on the SaaS type. User delegation SaaS and account SaaS must be ad hoc and do not support stored access policies. Question 26. A workload managed identity has SQLDB contributor on an Azure SQL database logical server. The identity is a Microsoft Entra principal in OrdersDB and can query it. The same identity cannot connect to AuditDB on that server. Engineers have validated network reachability and token acquisition. Which change most directly resolves the authorization gap? A. Assign SQL Server contributor at the logical server scope and request a new managed identity token. B. Create the managed identity as a Microsoft Entra principal in AuditDB and grant required permissions. C. Create the managed identity as a Microsoft Entra principal in master and grant required permissions there. D. Assign SQLDB contributor at the AuditDB resource scope and refresh the workload's access token. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create the managed identity as a Microsoft Entra principal in AuditDB and grant required permissions. Microsoft Entra query access is established inside each required database. Existing access to OrdersDB and an Azure RBAC role do not make the identity a principal in AuditDB. Question 27. You use an ARM template, not the Azure portal, to configure Azure SQL Database Auditing to an Azure Storage account by using the logical server's managed identity. Which prerequisite must you configure? A. Assign storage blob data contributor on the storage account to the logical server's managed identity. B. Assign SQL DB contributor on the destination storage account to the logical server's managed identity. C. Assign storage account contributor on the logical server to the storage account's managed identity. D. Assign Azure Event Hub's data sender on the storage account to the logical server's managed identity. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Assign storage blob data contributor on the storage account to the logical server's managed identity. For PowerShell, Azure CLI, REST API, or ARM template configuration of Azure SQL Database Auditing with managed identity, the server identity must receive storage blob data contributor on the destination storage account. The source separately notes that the Azure portal performs this role assignment automatically, which does not apply to this ARM template scenario. Question 28. An Azure subscription contains an Azure SQL Single Database, PAS, Azure Database for MySQL, PAS, SQL Server on an Azure VM, and Azure Cosmos DB. The company wants the umbrella Defender for Databases plan to protect all supported database types. An administrator is already signed in to the Azure portal. Arrange all 4 remaining actions in the required order. A. Select the relevant Azure subscription. B. Search for and select Microsoft Defender for Cloud. C. On the Defender Plans page, switch the Databases plan to On. D. In Microsoft Defender for Cloud, select Environment Settings. Lock in your answer. The correct order is, first, choice B. Search for and select Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Second, choice D. In Microsoft Defender for Cloud, select Environment Settings. Third, choice A. Select the relevant Azure subscription. Fourth, choice C. On the Defender Plans page, switch the Databases plan to On. After sign-in, the documented umbrella plan sequence is: open Microsoft Defender for Cloud, select Environment Settings, select the relevant subscription, and switch the Databases plan to On. The umbrella toggle activates all 4 database protection offerings. Question 29. A regulated workload stores data in Blob storage and Azure files. The organization must control the encryption keys and audit key rotation itself. Which 2 design choices satisfy the documented key management boundary? Select 2. A. Send a customer-provided key on Blob requests and use that same request mechanism for Azure files. B. Configure a customer-managed key for the storage account's Blob storage and Azure files encryption. C. Keep Microsoft-managed keys and rotate a Key Vault key on the organization's schedule. D. Keep the customer-managed key in Azure Key Vault or Azure Key Vault Managed HSM. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are D and B. D. Keep the customer-managed key in Azure Key Vault or Azure Key Vault Managed HSM. B. Configure a customer-managed key for the storage account's Blob storage and Azure files encryption. Customer-managed keys provide customer key control for the documented Blob storage and Azure files use, and those keys must be stored in Azure Key Vault or Azure Key Vault Managed HSM. Together, B and D satisfy both service coverage and custody. Question 30. A storage account uses its public endpoint, selected network rules, and a default action of deny. A partner uploads from an allowed subnet by using a SAS that includes an IP restriction. Which 2 statements correctly describe the remaining security checks? Select 2. A. The request must still satisfy the storage account authorization requirements. B. A storage data role assignment automatically adds the partner subnet to the firewall. C. The SaaS IP restriction can admit the request even if the firewall denies its source. D. The SaaS IP restriction can limit token use but cannot grant access beyond the network rules. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. A. The request must still satisfy the storage account authorization requirements. D. The SAS IP restriction can limit token use but cannot grant access beyond the network rules. Network admission and data authorization are separate. An allowed source must still meet the storage account authorization requirements. An IP restriction on a SAS narrows token use but does not create access that the network rules deny. Question 31. Defender for Storage on-upload malware scanning is enabled for a block blob ingestion account. An application uploads 20 blocks by using put block and then finalizes the blob by using put block list. When can this sequence trigger the malware scan? A. After every put block operation. B. When put block list commits the changes. C. When the committed blob is first read. D. It cannot trigger a scan because block blob writes do not qualify. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. When put block list commits the changes. Put block is an incremental operation and does not independently trigger malware scanning. Put block list finalizes the changes. Such a commit can produce the event that initiates a scan. Question 32. A storage account serves blob storage and queue storage. An administrator sets allow shared key access to false. Which two statements accurately predict SaaS request behavior? Select 2. A. A user delegation SaaS request to blob storage remains permitted because it uses Microsoft Entra ID. B. An account SaaS request to queue storage remains permitted when the SaaS grants read-only data access. C. A service SaaS request to blob storage remains permitted when associated with a stored access policy. D. Service SaaS and account SaaS requests remain denied for both named services in this configured storage account. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. A. A user delegation SaaS request to blob storage remains permitted because it uses Microsoft Entra ID. D. Service SaaS and account SaaS requests remain denied for both named services in this configured storage account. A and D are correct. With shared key authorization disallowed, blob storage user delegation SaaS requests remain permitted because they use Microsoft Entra ID. Service SaaS and account SaaS use shared key, and their requests are denied for all Azure Storage services. You have completed all 32 questions in SC-500 practice questions, storage and database security. Review the distinctions you missed, especially network admission, shared access signatures, key custody, database authorization, auditing, and Defender for databases and storage. Thanks for practicing with Web Lizard Lab's CertLab.